Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're navigating some potentially tricky economic waters. You sent over a really fascinating stack of articles about these new U.S. port fees, the ones targeting ships with ties to China. And we're going to unpack what it all means.
Absolutely. And your sources, they cover quite a bit, not just the proposed fees themselves, but also, the reactions we're seeing from China, obviously, but also the shipping industry. And there's some good analysis of the potential economic fallout. It's definitely a complex situation, lots of interconnected pieces.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to cut through the headlines, get to the core drivers behind these fees. Who's going to be most affected? What are the potential sort of knock-on effects for everyday goods, international relations? And we'll definitely touch on China's perspective, how they might push back. Okay, let's dive right in. What exactly are these proposed U.S. port fees?
Okay, so the USTR, that's the United States Trade Representative, they put forward this idea of service fees. And these could go up to, well, potentially $1.5 million on vessels with Chinese connections, calling it U.S. ports. This affects potentially both Chinese vessel operators and companies using ships built in China.
Wow, $1.5 million potentially? That's a big number. What were the specifics when this was first floated?
Well, initially the numbers were quite high, causing a fair bit of alarm. For Chinese maritime operators, the talk was up to $1 million per vessel entrance, or alternatively, $1,000 per net ton.
Okay, hang on. Net ton, what does that actually mean in simple terms?
Right, good question. It's basically a measure of the ship's internal volume, its cargo carrying capacity, not its weight, but the space inside for goods. So for a big container ship, $1,000 per net ton could add up incredibly fast.
Got it. So space, not weight. And what about for ships just built in China, not necessarily operated by Chinese companies?
For operators using those Chinese-built vessels, the initial proposal was somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million per entry. The exact amount would depend on how many Chinese-built ships were in their fleet, sort of a proportion thing.
Yeah,
These initial figures, yeah, they definitely caused significant concern across the industry.
I bet. Sounds like enough to make anyone nervous. But you mentioned they've adjusted the approach since then, maybe calmed things down a bit?
Yes, they have. The USTR later announced a phased approach, which means lower initial fees starting actually at $0. That $0 phase lasts for the first 180 days, starting from April 17th, 2025.
$0. Okay, that's quite a shift from $1.5 million. What happens after those 180 days?
After that grace period, the fees kick in, but based on vessel capacity, that net tonnage measure again. For Chinese owners or operators, it starts at $50 per net ton for each U.S. voyage. And that figure is set to increase incrementally over the next few years.
Okay, $50 per net ton, still a cost, but much lower initially. And for the Chinese-built ships?
For operators of those, the initial fee is lower, starting at $18 per net ton, and that will also gradually increase over time.
Right. And wasn't there another way they could calculate the fee for Chinese-built ships? Something about containers?
Correct. There's an alternative. Instead of the per net ton fee, they could pay $120 per container unloaded in the U.S., and that per container fee is also scheduled to rise up to $250 after 3 years.
So companies have a choice there, potentially, depending on their cargo and ship size. Are these fees applied every single time a ship docks?
No, there's a cap. It's limited to 5 times per year for any single vessel. And critically, it applies per rotation of port calls.
Per rotation. Explain that.
So if a ship comes into, say, Los Angeles, then goes up to Oakland, then Seattle, all on one trip to the U.S. West Coast that's considered one rotation, they wouldn't pay the fee at each of those ports on that single voyage, just once for the rotation, up to the 5-time annual limit per ship.
Ah, okay, that makes a big difference compared to paying at every single stop. Are there any ships or services that get a pass entirely? Any exemptions?
Yes, a couple of important ones. U.S. flag carriers using Chinese-built ships are exempt if they're mainly doing short sea service. Think like routes just between nearby U.S. ports, not long international voyages.
Okay, so coastal shipping might be okay.
Right. And also, specialty export vessels are mentioned as exempt. And liquid bulk carriers, so tankers carrying oil, chemicals, that sort of thing, they're out too.
All right, that paints a clear picture of the mechanics of the fees. Let's get to the why now. What's the U.S. government's rationale? What problem are they trying to solve here?
Well, the USTR did an investigation, Section 301 investigation, actually. And their finding was that China has used, well, significant seat subsidies and other policies to unfairly prop up its shipbuilding industry. This, the USTR argues, has led China basically dominate the global market, creating an uneven playing field.
So it's framed as an unfair competition issue.
Exactly. The stated goal, and I'm quoting loosely here, is to reverse Chinese dominance, deal with perceived threats to the U.S. supply chain, and importantly, send a demand signal for U.S.-built ships.
Right. Trying to encourage shipbuilding back home. Okay, so that's the U.S. angle. Now, the reactions. This must have stirred things up. How is China responding?
Predictably, not positively. From China's perspective, a key argument is that these fees might violate international trade rules. They could very well challenge this at the World Trade Organization, the WTO,
On what grounds?
likely arguing that the fees are discriminatory, that they violate the WTO's agreement on trade-related investment measures, or TRIMs, basically saying these fees unfairly target Chinese entities rather than addressing a legitimate trade issue across the board.
So, a potential WTO fight looms. Any other international agreements in play? I remember seeing something about law of the sea.
Yes, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLS, it enshrines principles like freedom of navigation, non-discrimination on the high seas. Now, interestingly, the U.S. hasn't actually ratified UNCLS. They're not a signatory.
Oh, right. So, how could it apply?
Well, many of its principles are considered customary international law, things most nations accept anyway. So, even though the U.S. isn't formally signed on, China and others could still argue these fees violate those widely accepted maritime principles. It adds another layer to the diplomatic and legal arguments.
Okay, interesting dynamic there. What about the industry that's actually paying these fees, the shipping lines? What's their take?
They are definitely not happy. The World Shipping Council, which represents major container lines, they've expressed serious concerns. Their main point is that these fees will ultimately hurt the U.S. economy and consumers. They argue it won't significantly boost U.S. shipbuilding, but will make imports more expensive. They've called it a step in the wrong direction.
So they see it hurting the U.S. more than helping it. Any specific worries beyond just the cost?
Oh, several. One is that the net tonnage basis disproportionately hits the biggest, most efficient ships, the ones that carry the most cargo. They pay more, which seems counterintuitive if you want efficiency.
Yeah, this seems odd.
They're also really concerned about a separate fee mentioned in some reports, specifically on vehicles unloaded from foreign-built ships. They call that an arbitrary action that would almost certainly lead to higher car prices for Americans.
Higher car prices. Yeah, people would notice that. What else?
A big worry is cargo diversion. The fear is that carriers might just say, okay, fine, we'll unload in Vancouver or Ensenada instead. Offload the cargo in Canada or Mexico, then truck or rail it across the border to avoid the U.S. port fee.
Ah, bypassing U.S. ports. That could hurt dock workers, port traffic.
Exactly. Less work for U.S. longshore workers, less revenue for U.S. ports. That's a major concern. We also heard from exporters, especially in agriculture and bulk goods, saying they were already having trouble booking ships because of all this uncertainty.
Wow. So ripple effects hitting U.S. exporters too. What about businesses within the U.S. that rely on imports? What are they saying?
They're worried, too. Shippers and maritime businesses warn that these high costs could, frankly, put smaller companies out of business. Others might just reroute their supply chains away from U.S. shores if it becomes too expensive. Some U.S. exports might even become uncompetitive globally if shipping costs rise too much. The American Apparel and Footwear Association, for instance, predicted potentially devastating consequences.
Such as?
Higher prices for clothes and shoes, obviously, but also maybe shrinking GDP, fewer U.S. exports overall. Pretty serious stuff.
It really sounds like the potential economic impacts could be quite widespread, far beyond just the ships themselves, and then there's the fear of retaliation.
Yes, that came up. A freight broker explicitly warned that China could easily turn around and slap similar fees on U.S. ships calling at the ports. A sort of tit-for-tat scenario that could escalate things quickly and make global shipping even more expensive and complicated for everyone.
Right, a trade spat nobody really wants. Let's zoom out again. The context here is crucial U.S.-China trade and this shipbuilding disparity. China's dominance is pretty stark, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's huge. China builds the vast majority of the world's merchant ships now. Over half the ships currently sailing and over half the ships currently on order are Chinese-built. The U.S., by contrast, builds very, very few large commercial vessels annually, maybe less than 1% of the global total, depending on how you measure it. It's a massive imbalance.
That really puts the USTR's goal of reversing dominance into perspective. It's a monumental task. And that phased approach you mentioned, starting at zero fees, that seems to acknowledge it's a long game, right? You can't rebuild an industry overnight.
Exactly. Starting low and ramping up suggests the administration knows this will take years, maybe decades. It requires sustained investment, policy consistency, building up shipyard capacity, and the skilled workforce. It's not a quick fix. assuming, of course, the policy stays in place across different administrations.
Good point. Are there other related moves the USTR is making in the maritime space besides these specific port fees?
Yes. They're also looking at tariffs on other key port equipment made in China. They asked for public comment on potentially hitting Chinese-made ship-to-shore cranes with 100% tariffs.
The huge cranes that load and unload containers? Wow, 100%.
Yes. And also tariffs on containers themselves and the chassis they sit on, potentially ranging from 20% up to 100%. And this would be on top of any existing tariffs. So it's a broader push impacting multiple parts of the port ecosystem, not just the vessels.
Okay, a multi-pronged approach. Now, back to China's reaction. We talked about the WTO. What else are they doing? Any diplomatic moves?
Definitely. They've launched what looks like a significant public relations and diplomatic effort. They're actively lobbying other countries, trying to persuade them to resist these U.S. tariffs. The messaging is that this is unilateralism, protectionism, bullying, bad for the whole global trading system.
Who's involved in this push?
We've seen reports of Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaking out quite strongly. And even President Xi Jinping apparently discussed it on recent trips to Vietnam and Cambodia. So they seem to be trying to build a sort of coalition, or at least generate international unease about the U.S. actions.
Trying to isolate the U.S. position, perhaps? What about using other international forums?
Besides the potential WTO case, there was some talk, according to sources, about possibly raising it informally at the UN Security Council, framing it maybe as economic coercion. It shows they're exploring various channels, legal, diplomatic, public relations, to push back.
Okay, a full court press, it sounds like. Is there any way for the shipping companies themselves to, get around these fees? Any loopholes being discussed?
Well, there's always speculation. Reflagging vessels is one idea you hear, like registering a ship under the flag of a country not targeted by these fees.
Is that easy to do?
Not necessarily. It involves costs, regulations, potential crewing issues. It's not a simple switch. Others might explore more complex shipping routes, maybe using transshipment hubs more, to minimize direct calls at U.S. ports with affected vessels. But again, the feasibility, the cost-effectiveness, the overall impact, it's all pretty uncertain right now. It might just shift costs around rather than eliminate them.
It really does feel like a complex chess match, doesn't it? Every move potentially triggering countermoves and unintended consequences. Let's bring this home for our listeners. Okay, this all sounds very high-level ships, trade rules, geopolitics. Why should someone listening right now care? How could this actually affect them?
That's the crucial connection. These fees, even though they're levied way upstream on ships at ports, they have a real potential to trickle down. Increased shipping costs almost inevitably get passed along the supply chain. That means the price you pay for, well, almost anything imported could go up. Electronics, clothes, furniture, food. So much comes in on these ships.
So potentially hitting our wallets directly.
Potentially, yes. And beyond prices, there's the broader economic stability issue. If this escalates into a bigger U.S.-China trade dispute, that creates uncertainty. Uncertainty can dampen investment, slow economic growth, impact jobs, so the ripples can spread quite wide.
Right. It's not just about a fee on a ship. It's about the whole system that brings us the goods we use every day.
Exactly. It really highlights how interconnected everything is in the global economy. Actions targeting one specific area, like shipbuilding, can have surprisingly far-reaching effects.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's summarize. What are the absolute key takeaways someone should hold on to from all this?
I think number one, the U.S. is using these port fees strategically, trying to counter China's massive dominance in shipbuilding, which they see as unfair. Number two, this move has sparked strong opposition, both from China, who might fight it at the WTO, and from the shipping industry itself. They're worried about higher costs hitting consumers, potential retaliation, and more supply chain chaos.
Yeah.
And number three, the phased rollout, starting at zero, shows this is a long-term play by the U.S., an attempt to slowly rebuild its own shipbuilding sector, but the outcome is far from certain.
So as these fees, even the initial low ones, start coming into effect, we'll be watching closely. How does the shipping world actually adapt? Does this policy actually succeed in boosting American shipbuilding? Does China launch that formal WTO challenge? And maybe most importantly for many of us, what does it ultimately mean for the flow of goods around the world and the prices we end up paying? It's definitely a complex web, and hopefully this deep dive has given you a clearer view of the forces at work. Thanks for exploring these potentially choppy waters with us today.